First, I'm Jack Kalavritinos, Senior Director here at APCO Worldwide, and I'm very excited about this all-star panel that we have today. Thank each of our panelists in advance for carving out this hour of time, and each of you who have dialed in today to listen to this discussion and really take part in this interactive event. Having served both at HHS in the Bush administration under Secretary Leavitt and then Deputy Secretary Azar, and in this administration under Secretary Price, Commissioner Gottlieb, and Secretary Azar on external and intergovernmental affairs and communications issues, I've had a chance to work in some capacity with each of the three panelists today. I'm going to set up the issue, introduce our panelists, and then we're going to jump right into questions. Viewers, please use the Q&A function to ask questions, and our goal is to get to as many of them as possible during the program. So let's get started. The last time drug pricing was the dominant issue, a healthcare issue here in Washington, was obviously pre-COVID. And like everything during this time of COVID-19 has been pushed into the background. COVID 24/7 and pricing issues have largely been around the speculation and at times commitments about the affordability of future therapeutics and vaccines. During this time of response and shutdowns, at least on the pharma side, we've seen historic collaboration and intense media focus on how pharmaceutical companies as innovators can help to save lives, our economy, and our way of life. Our APCO proprietary insight research has also shown, really starting in April, an improvement in the reputation of life sciences firms. Their innovations and commitment and close working relationship with government has helped with an industry that has seen its image battered in the past few years. The focus today is specifically on the 4 executive orders and the Kodak announcement, and we can also weave in the Buy American executive order that is going to be signed from what we understand today. First, let's make sure we're all on the same page with these 4 EOs and the Kodak announcement. These are obviously part of the Trump administration's focus on drug pricing and are directly or indirectly related to the blueprint that was unveiled in 2018 and was really the centerpiece of the administration's healthcare focus post-repeal and replace efforts. The first is aimed at preventing, quote, middlemen, also known as pharmacy benefit managers, from pocketing, as the president says, gigantic discounts. HHS estimates there are $150 billion in rebates to middlemen, as is said, often exchanged for more favorable insurance coverage for their drugs. The second order, which the president said may not need to be implemented, would allow Medicare to purchase drugs at the same prices that other countries pay, first known as the International Reference Pricing Rule, and now most favored nation status. The order would specifically allow Medicare to implement a so-called international pricing index to bring drug prices in line with what other nations pay. The third would allow states, pharmacies, and wholesalers, if approved, to import drugs from Canada where they typically cost less than the US, as long as it's approved by the FDA. And the fourth targets insulin prices, requiring federal community health centers to pass on discounts that they receive on insulin EpiPens directly to patients. We're also going to discuss the Kodak decision that the administration announced, a $765 million loan to the iconic photography company as part of a U.S. plan to rebuild the domestic pharmaceutical manufacturing effort. And we also mentioned earlier that there's going to be a second executive order likely signed today as well. Yet on the Kodak announcement, obviously it's been in the news with some scrutiny from the Hill and from the SEC. Now let's jump into just quickly introducing our panel. Let's start with Dr. Kavita Patel. Dr. Patel is a member of APCO Worldwide's International Advisory Council. She's a healthcare policy specialist and a board-certified physician whose expertise centers on issues such as delivery system reform and access and coverage and quality. She's a fellow and managing director of delivery systems and reform at Brookings Institution's Engelberg Center. She's also an advisor to the Aspen Institute. Previously served in the Obama administration under the White House for the White House Office of Public Engagement and Intergovernmental Affairs. And prior to that, she was deputy staff director on the Health Committee when the chair was Senator Ted Kennedy. Recently, she co-authored a piece with another member of our IAC on telemedicine and the importance of broadband access. And something I learned recently is that Kavita is a former National Spelling Bee champ. So make sure that if you do email her after, you use spell check. Jim Stansel. Jim is Executive Vice President and General Counsel for pharma. He's responsible for leading a team of lawyers in supporting pharma's policy, advocacy, and science priorities in the development of sound legal policies impacting the pharma industry. He previously served as Acting General Counsel at HHS, where he was Chief Legal Officer, and was Senior Counselor and Deputy General Counsel, where he and I had a chance to work together on a number of issues. Like all of us, he's been juggling work from home and past and future school closures, along with his six kids at home, and doing a lot of juggling. And by the way, Jim, I saw something on the news that there's a surge in mini backyards, tiny house offices, and was wondering maybe if that's something you've considered to sort of get away from everything. Becky Wood leads Sidley's Food and Drug and Medical Device Regulatory Practice and the DC Healthcare and FDA group at Sidley. She also serves on the firm's COVID-19 task force and advises FDA-regulated clients on a range of COVID medical countermeasures, including the regulation of PPE, emergency use authorizations, immunity considerations under the PrEP Act, and has really been helping clients bring important new therapies to patients who need them, especially on an accelerated and breakthrough pathways. It was an honor serving with her at the FDA in this administration, where she served as chief counsel, where she worked on every significant initiative addressed by Scott Gottlieb and agency leadership on a host of issues, from addiction to streamlining drug and device development to including addressing drug pricing. Now, let's get started. Let's kick things off with Jim Stansel. Jim, please give us your thoughts on the timing of these executive orders. I've heard a lot, we've all heard a lot in your industry talk about not only the substantive issues with some of these, but also upset with the timing. I know that your boss, Steve Ubel, CEO of pharma, had some pretty strong words talking about them being a reckless distraction, and really wanted to get your viewpoint of the EOs generally and the timing in particular.
Yeah, thank you, Jack. Great to be here with you. Thanks for inviting me. I do think, it should be clear to everybody that the sole focus of this industry really should be on finding solutions to the COVID situation. We're spending enormous time and resources in clinical trials and other research to figure out how to get out of this box. And, in the midst of that, the president has announced these executive orders, including the one on most favored nation that you suggested, and essentially tells us that we have 30 days to come to the table and figure out a good solution. Obviously, that diverts our attention away from what we should be doing. I think, again, it should be obvious that when you're facing, potential extreme structural change and financial change, you're going to have to, really push back against that and figure out, how to deal with those proposals. And unfortunately, that does take away from the other things that we should be doing. I hate to think of the number of hours that our member companies have spent thinking about this as opposed to thinking about fighting COVID. So it is very poor timing, and frankly, it's really unfortunate. I think it's also not maybe a surprise that it comes, right before the election. And unfortunately, I think the president's made a calculation that this may help his re-election chances to be tough on the industry. But really do think that that's unfortunate in the context, certainly, of what we're doing to fight COVID-19 at this time. So a lot of concern, absolutely, on our end.
Thank you. I don't know if Kavita or Becky, you also want to comment on this particular EO. I know the White House calls it the foreign, and HHS the foreign freeloading issue, and there really is a populist view that others are benefiting from what it is that the U.S. government and U.S. patients are paying. Is there another way, perhaps, that this gap can possibly be reduced and get to the ultimate goal without necessarily this particular policy? And I don't know whether either of you want to comment on that.
And I can take an initial shot. I mean, I think as Jim indicates, it shouldn't be a surprise to anybody in an election year. You know, it is a playbook that presidents of both administrations use to use executive orders fairly aggressively as you get into an election cycle. So probably no surprise from that perspective. Clearly, this is an absolutely extraordinary time for this industry, and it plays a really signal role in terms of developing medical countermeasures for COVID. And also dealing with a number of unintended consequences. You know, clients are working on shortage issues. They're working with standing up their own supply chains, being essential, making sure their own employees can work properly from home, dealing with the access to manufacturing facilities, API that may be coming in externally. And so it truly is an extraordinary time. And I think the pricing debate has been an important one for a long time. One aspect of it that sometimes gets left out is the question of value. You know, is it just price or is it actually value? Because, you know, we know that Congress has also passed the 21st Century Cures Act, has put a real focus on creating incentives to develop cures, particularly for patients that have rare diseases, that have conditions with no therapies. And so it's always a balance in that kind of a system to make sure that you also create the right incentives to develop safe and effective products, particularly for patients that have no therapies, patients with novel illnesses. So the value question sometimes gets a little bit left out of that debate.
Jack, I'll just offer, those are perfect comments, and what I'll do is just kind of round it out with, you asked like what else could be done, or what are some other alternatives to consider besides kind of the like, unfortunately, executive orders can only do so much. There's so many aspects of this that are technically, I think, you know, require legislative changes in order to deliver on what I think most Americans would like, which is decreased out-of-pocket costs. So I think that's, at the end of the day, I think a lot of this is, you know, can anything really deliver on that promise? And unfortunately, I would just offer that, like, the majority of people, including many health economists or people who spend time thinking about policy and financing like myself, very few people understand kind of each aspect of, you know, what I like to call it, how a drug becomes a drug, or why is it that what you pay out of pocket at, quote, whatever, CVS, Walgreens, insert pharmacy name here, is incredibly variable. So I think that if I were to kind of offer, like, what are some tangible things that could be done, it would be taking a hard look at some of the extensions, patent things that people just don't want to do, but do require legislative heft around generics, around kind of like exclusivity. And I would say that it's actually a smaller degree of medications that kind of create a little bit of the pain points that a lot of Americans are feeling. And you can also talk about specific specialty focused areas. So I think there's a lot that can be done. We can get into conversation later about, you know, when and where is there a political will to do the combination legislative and regulatory mechanisms. And then I'll just close by saying that a lot of people, including myself, had a mistaken belief that we could use kind of the shift to alternative payment models for providers as a way to really have like an impact on, I'll call it pharmaceutical spending. So the notion that if we incentivize providers, like oncologists, for example, to choose if there are drugs that have decent equal efficacy, the lower cost, then that would result in a decrease in overall pharmaceutical spending, for example, through these kind of alternative payment models. And candidly, like, evaluations of such payment models have not yielded necessarily that direct result. That doesn't mean that alternative payment models can't do it, but I think it's a little slow to start to understand how to shape the impact. And what we've found, at least in oncology, in research that we've done, is that it's actually not the Part B drugs, it's actually the Part D as in dog drugs, which opens up again this conversation around generics and exclusivity and other things. So I'll stop there.
Thank you,
Jack,
so much.
if I can just add, you know, you asked about foreign freeloading, and I think there's absolutely no doubt that occurs all over the world on a regular basis. And these many countries come in with threats about compulsory licensing and other things. And what ends up happening, frankly, is that they end up paying more for generic products than the United States, substantially more for generic products than the United States, and substantially less for branded products, squeezing essentially the pipeline of new products coming to the market. And I think there's absolutely things that can be done, but many of them need to be done, frankly, outside of the United States. That's where the problems are happening. And so we've been encouraging the administration to use the authority that it already has under the trade agreements that really should actually prevent many of these abuses that the countries are engaged in. We should take the fight to them instead of bringing and importing, frankly, the bad policies that they implement that result. Department of Commerce has done studies on this. I mean, it results in fewer new drugs by artificially depressing the prices in some of these countries. So take the fight to them. They're not paying their fair share. It's two wrongs doesn't make a right here. We should go out and use our trade power to really fight what they're doing, as opposed to adopting what they're doing, which is essentially what the most favored nation policy would do. It would take advantage essentially of the bad acting that they're doing, and then import that in the United States. That's exactly the wrong way to do it. It's attacking it from exactly the wrong position.
I mean, that is an excellent point. And I think that one thing about this administration that in some ways is unlike any other, at least any other Republican administration, is really willing to take it to our trading partners on a host of trade matters, which is what happened with NAFTA. And now you have a deal that is roundly applauded by many, whether in business and labor. And so that's a good point in terms of taking the fight to others. Let's quickly talk about executive orders versus the regulatory process. So I don't want to make people's heads spin and eyes glaze over, but let's face it, we know that executive orders don't have the force of law, and yet this administration at times, I believe, has expertly used them at least for a way to capture the attention better than, let's say, we're going to roll out a rule and then the media snoozes and doesn't really pay attention to it when that happens. So if we could just talk a little bit about what you all predict in terms of active steps that will likely or maybe not likely in the coming months come out of these executive orders in terms of the real substance, which is either a whole regulatory process that takes a while or possible legislation. So I don't know who wants to jump on that first. Becky, I don't know if you want to jump on that question or.
Sure, I'll take the bait and try to get us started. I mean, I think there is a way to look at an executive order as essentially being an underscore, an exclamation point, right? It is a big way to focus emphasis by any administration on a particular priority. Getting that actually inculcated into law is, of course, a much more complex process. And so if you look, for example, at the proposed rule on Canadian importation, what the executive order says is essentially, I order you to finish that process. It doesn't tell us the time frame. And as everybody knows, I think, that's an incredibly interesting and fraught issue. We have a statute that basically has been around for 2 decades that requires that in order to import from abroad, you have to make a showing that it will be equally safe and it will save money to the system. And for about 20 years, people thought that was essentially a null set. And you had Democratic and Republican administrations year in, year out saying, we really don't see how this will be done. And so I think, as folks know, at the end of last year, at the end of December, there was a proposed rule that HHS came out with to try to thread that needle. They've gotten an extraordinary number of comments, over 1,200 comments. And as everybody knows, the process of actually making rules, of doing rulemaking, is quite a complex one. An agency has to go through and read all of the comments, respond to them, take a look at what they proposed, see if there are any impediments, respond to that, and then ultimately decide whether they can issue a revised rule. They also have to, from an administrative law perspective, make sure that it's what's called a logical outgrowth of what they initially proposed. And so all of this, as a matter of good rulemaking process, takes time, takes input. And it is very hard to get a rule finalized in a year or even 2 years in the normal course. And then, of course, once it's finalized, it's subject to potential litigation and it has to be applied. So, you know, in all of these things, I think there is an underscoring and emphasis from a political perspective, but there is a well-trod path that you have to go through to get these things finalized that do inevitably take time.
Thank you for that. And considering the time that you spent at the FDA, you know these rulemaking processes better than anyone, as well as knowing, you know, FDA's feeling about this longstanding issue as well. Kavita, do you see any of these four, if let's just say that all four started a regulatory process, and having been on the transition, you know, was part of the effort to take a look at the regs that were already in place from the Obama administration. Do you think a possible Biden administration could possibly see any of these as ones that they would allow to continue moving forward, considering the fact that these are not your typical partisan issues that fall, you know, along our RD blue-red lines?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of kind of bipartisan support for these. I think there's more cynicism, frankly, about moving the process through from EO through the regulatory process about its true impact at the end. I think that's where the cynicism is, not necessarily out of a desire to kind of just stop the process entirely. But what I could see happening is that, you know, there's something bigger that is done that signals more of a quote message that is done by the administration that ends up kind of preempting or superseding some of this. And then you could see kind of the, you know, bureaucracy almost kind of just taking its time to get through things, or candidly, like many things, getting tied up in OMB for final approvals and kind of the clearances, which in general, no matter what administration, is generally where these things get hung up at. I'm sure people can commiserate that ends up being, even when there's incredible will and intention, that there is just a final gauntlet that just is hard to get through. I would just say that I know that something that many Democrats are looking for, the president made some comments in the last couple of days, as well as a couple of weeks ago, about a new set of, I assume it's an executive order on, quote, health reform. I don't think that'll have drug pricing in it. It doesn't sound like it will, but honestly, Jack, like depending on what that looks like, you could see there being in a transition team kind of an entire like stop anything that was started in the Trump administration because of a sentiment that this just needs to be started over again, or that they want something that's more like HR 3 to come forward and have a little more legislative momentum depending on the makeup of a Congress.
Great.
Yeah, I think those are great points. Let me just add, Becky mentioned on, you know, importation, that process, at least on the commercial importation side, of course, has already started last December, and Becky mentioned there's been a lot of comments on that. You know, one thing to note there is that you know, this executive order came out and it ordered actually 3 different things to happen. So not just commercial importation, but also waivers on the personal importation side, and then reimportation of insulin as well. And it's interesting because not only are the administration folks having to deal with literally decades worth of statements and history here of concerns, really serious concerns about safety of importation, as well as an inability to really be able to say that this would save the American consumer money. And that's an important distinction, because it's not just saving the system money or the government money, it actually has to save consumers money. And I think there's a lot of economists who believe that the arbitrage that would happen with importation means that the middlemen get more money, but the patients don't end up seeing really all that much, if anything, at the end of the day. So not only do they have to sort of deal with those issues, but they have to deal with their own statements in this administration. I mean, Secretary Azar said explicitly that he thought importation was a gimmick. I mean, that was in his nomination hearing or confirmation hearing. Just, you know, in December, when the administration issued the proposed rule on commercial importation, it explicitly said in that rule that it was not going to move forward with personal importation because it didn't think it could do it safely. And now you see the executive order saying, essentially ordering them to move forward. So is the secretary going to certify to something that 6 months ago he thought was not safe? I mean, I don't know. That seems to be what the executive orders are suggesting. I'll just note as well from a regulatory perspective, of course, it's hard to know what will actually happen, but on the MFN order, they're clearly talking about moving forward very quickly. The procedural posture of that particular program was that there was an advance notice of proposed rulemaking issued, nearly 2 years ago. Comments were received. There's been a proposed rule sitting, to Kavita's point, sitting at OMB for like 18 months. And now, some are suggesting that they're just going to skip over the proposed rule stage and just go straight to an interim final rule. Well, I'll defer to Becky Wood, her thoughts on good cause that you have to prove, but winning an election is not good cause under the Administrative Procedures Act. So I think it's going to be very difficult for this administration to at least legally move forward in a way with some of these proposals, just because of the background and the history here.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I mean, obviously, a president of any party can say what they want in an executive order to make an important political point to them, a policy point. It still has to comply with law, and it still is open to challenge by law, and that's a big process. And particularly when you're dealing with prescription drugs, FDA has an extraordinary mission from Congress. A very, very long history, more than a century, of really holding out the gold standard in terms of patient safety, efficacy, review of pharmacovigilance, and you're introducing potentially in this proposal a very different kind of system. And so you're really going against a long history, bipartisan, of an approach to how we make sure that we have the world's premierly safe and effective drug supply. And how you manage that is a really complicated thing. So a lot of moving parts would have to come into place.
Great. Let's move on to the issue of PBMs, middlemen, rebates. I'm sort of surprised that we're halfway into it. We haven't even really talked about it. And yet this was, at least when we were at HHS, Becky, I mean, this was the biggest piece of the blueprint. This was the Super Bowl, and it made it to OMB, and then it was pulled back. And now it's being, announced through this EO, but it's different, and I know that there's caveats in there that has led maybe some who supported it more not to support it as much this time. But this truly, if it were to be eventually implemented, would be truly groundbreaking, just because of how it would change the landscape of how drugs are paid for in these rebates. Who would like to talk about that in terms of maybe why has there been less than an enthusiastic reaction, considering that this was something that industry saw as a real positive, and then what your thoughts are for the future of it?
I'm happy to start. We certainly support moving forward with the rebate rule. Maybe again, distraction. There's so many other things going on. You don't hear our support through the din that's elsewhere. But I mean, I think there's no doubt that the rebate system is broken. It's a strange system. It's a bizarre system that really doesn't exist other places. And what has happened is it's created a widening gap between list and net prices. That results really in increased cost sharing for patients, and unfortunately, it impacts the sickest patients. The sickest patients end up essentially cross-subsidizing the well patients, and that's because a lot of these rebates that manufacturers are giving to PBMs and plans are going to lower the premiums, not to actually go to the patient at the point of sale. And I think that's the brilliance, frankly, of this rule, is that it actually does fundamentally change the structure, but by doing something very important, which is encouraging the patients to receive essentially the net price, the rebates at the pharmacy counter itself, and so they immediately will see savings. And right now, a lot of that's being lost. You've got depending on who you ask, $175 billion in rebates and discounts and other things floating around out there that frankly aren't really making their way to patients. And so I mean, I think that this is a fundamentally important rule, and it's going to, at the end of the day, it's going to create better incentives, which will actually help to decrease list prices in the future. I mean, I think it's just overall a very positive thing that will end up, most importantly, with better outcomes for patients who will see these savings immediately at the pharmacy counter.
Thank you, Jim. I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in on that. I certainly have seen some ads from PCMA, so the PBM Association, that have been pretty hard hitting. In fact, the president has talked about some of the hard hitting drug ads. Some of them actually were on this issue, on the rebate issue, coming at it from, from the point of view of the other industry. So Kavita, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on this.
I mean, I guess I'll just add that I think I personally, I even recall kind of stating like very publicly, like, this makes a lot of sense. It's, a pretty smart set of actions to expose what I think people have not largely understood about the process, like I said, of kind of how from a drug goes from a manufacturer into actual patient's hands, and the costs associated with it. Since we've seen this incredible consolidation amongst health insurance providers, health insurance companies, and PBM companies, I think you're seeing where there is an incredible amount of motivation for, candidly, certain insurance companies, which also own a very large share of a PBM or outright own it, to have these relationships. So I think that it's just exposed to me the complexity. Trying to do this and attacking just kind of one piece of it has exposed the inability to truly deal with it, because it's not taking into consideration the fact that a health insurance company can strongly benefit on their MLR if they have a kind of a fixed negotiation with the PBM, and then obviously the PBM in turn with, a Part B provider, for example. So I think there's a lot of incentives that are difficult to deal with, and what I would say kind of this surgical precision of an executive order, or a rule, a proposed rulemaking kind of a vehicle. And I think that's why it's going to be hard to do any of this unless you kind of attack it a little more broadly. I will also say, just in general, I think that people, in light of how quickly manufacturers have been pivoting to help with COVID treatments and vaccines, it is going to be one of these like slaps in the face. We're going to see treatments and vaccines produced in like truly like warp speed. That's why it's called Operation Warp Speed. And yet there's going to be this kind of perception like, slapping one hand to reward the other. And that's not going to play out very well, even amongst the American public will not necessarily like the fact that you could make an argument that if you did some of these things, you would not necessarily have some of what we've said is pretty great progress. But I do suspect the PBM issue should not and will not go away.
That's a good point. All your points were great, but the one at the end is especially important, considering that we are on the hopefully moving towards the cusp of a or multiple vaccines. Then the whole next issue is going to be production distribution. And let's face it, PBMs are absolutely key to the whole issue of distribution, working hand in hand, with their customers and with patients. And frankly, I'm sure they're going to be government entities, including DoD, might be enlisted in order to get vaccines out. On the positive front, so it looks like the focus on high drug prices from the administration, from Congress, from the media, has to some degree led to a leveling off of some of the biggest increases. And so I'm just wondering, there are a range of tools that help patients, that are available for patients. And there's also the issue of generics and how the backload has been reduced greatly, and some innovations made at the FDA, Becky, when you were there. Any thoughts that we want to talk about in terms of some of the good news in terms of out-of-pocket costs having gone down? Because I know we've talked a lot about, some of these regulatory and policy issues looking forward into the future. Jim, I don't know, let's say, I know
Yeah.
that pharma highlights this issue quite a bit. I don't know if you had any other detail that you wanted to mention on that.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I mean, it is absolutely true that the drug, both price growth and spending growth has been declining or you know at the rate of inflation or less for the last couple of years. But interesting, you mentioned you know, out-of-pocket costs. Actually, because of benefit design changes, those patients that have a deductible have seen their out-of-pocket costs actually increase by 50% over the last 5 years. So you have this strange situation where net prices are staying about the same or declining, and yet out-of-pocket costs are not necessarily following suit. Part of the reason for that, I mentioned benefit design. If you look at what patients pay for out of pocket for different things in the healthcare system, it's pretty illuminating. If you look at what they pay for prescription drugs, it's about 12–13% of retail medicine spending that they pay for out of pocket. Now compare that to hospital spending, which is about 4% that they pay out of pocket. So if you ask somebody who's had both expenditures, they're going to say, yeah, those drugs, they're more expensive. You know, I'm paying more for them. But that's a benefit design issue as opposed to essentially a price issue per se. You know, I think what we talked about with respect to the rebate rule is applicable here too, because, you know, when you think about all the rebates and discounts and everything, there's a lot of money sloshing around in the system. There's about 50% of the dollars are going to somebody other than the manufacturer who made the drug and took the risk to research and everything else. The other 50% of that list price is going to somebody else, and a lot of it, frankly, is not going directly to the patient. So again, there's a difference, there's a disconnect between prices on the one hand and then what patients are feeling, you know, when they go to the pharmacy counter on the other. So it is an interesting and unfortunate dynamic, but you know, at the same time, it's good to see that the net prices are remaining relatively stable.
And I know that pharmacists and independent pharmacists aren't the ones receiving that, which is why they were shoulder to shoulder in supporting the original rebate rule, because they want to see their customers who are coming in and buying these pharmaceuticals, you know, receiving the benefit of that pretty big percentage of costs that is, you know, something that they're not able to get their own discount on. And I think the word rebate is confusing to your average person, because I think they think of it in terms of their own personal rebate when it's actually part of this complicated, messy process that isn't going to them. What I know the administration wants is discounts for people, but certainly it makes it challenging for pharmacists to have to explain any of this to their patients. I don't know if we want to talk a bit about generics also, whether you and Becky want to talk about that, because I think, you know, there's some good news that's been had in the last couple of years on the generic side as well. And anything else you wanted to add?
Yeah, maybe I'll just add that, you know, a not insignificant percentage of people who go to the pharmacy counter end up having their cost sharing based on list price as opposed to the net price. So a plan that's you know, that's getting a product that may have $100 list price and they're getting it for $60. The patient may be paying their cost sharing, and increasingly it's co-insurance as opposed to a copay. That's based not on the $60 that the insurance company is spending, but the $100 that the list price is. And so they're not only are they not seeing it, but you know, and it happens. You know, sometimes they're actually paying more than their insurance company pays for it. I mean, that's a pretty strange system that we have. I'll just say, and then I'll defer to Becky on the generic side. You know, from our view, it's great to see that generic utilization has increased. I mean, we're at like 90% now of products or of prescriptions in the United States are filled with generics. That's good. I mean, that's the way the patent system should work. That's the way the exclusivity should work. And you know, I challenge anyone to to find another place in the healthcare system where a product or a service that is new and has come on the market eventually becomes almost free at the end of the day. I mean, you're never going to see that with hospital services. You're never going to see that with physician services, and yet with prescription drugs, you see that. Medical device as well, but prescription drugs largely.
Good point.
Yeah, and I think what I would add to that is, the system, as Jim alludes to, is designed to both reward innovation for a period of time and also then migrate to a system of lower cost. And, certainly FDA in recent years, if there's any bright spot here, has had an extraordinary high watermark, both in terms of record approvals of new therapies for illnesses that don't have good therapy, and also a record in terms of approving generics. I think as Kavita alluded to, there was a backup in the generics office for some time that was subject to a lot of criticism that has been dug through. And so I think a lot of people would argue that system is operating better than it ever has. Obviously, always room for improvements.
Let's switch over to the supply chain and the Kodak decision. And what do you all think? And maybe since you have the floor, Becky, start with you. What do you think the ramifications that really, not only for this particular loan and for Kodak, and obviously it's iconic and the stock price, now there's an investigation, but what this might mean if this amount of federal funds might be used for other companies? Will we see some sort of modest shift to the US for some of this type of manufacturing that has been largely in India and China?
Yeah, I mean, just to level set, I think as probably everybody on the call is aware, an extraordinary majority of the API, the active pharmaceutical ingredient that goes into the drugs that are put into finished product in the US comes from abroad, particularly from China and India. And, I think there has been for a long time concern and consideration about quality in that space, oversight, inspections of those facilities, and, potential deep security considerations. And so I think this is sort of part of that long-term policy conversation. Also, of course, with respect to COVID, when you start to see, some breakdowns in terms of cross-border ability, I think it shines an increased light. And so this is certainly an extraordinary statement to invest, almost $750 million or $1 trillion, in one API manufacturer. And I think you're going to see a lot of interest in whether that can be migrated more to the United States. Obviously, you have to balance all of the considerations in terms of cost and quality, which is, of course, very, very important.
Great. Why don't
maybe I'll just say, sorry,
Jack.
just real quick. While we don't represent generic manufacturers, we only represent the branded side. I'll say, we certainly support efforts to foster more manufacturing in the United States, but I do think people need to realize that there is real value in actually a diversified supply chain, and frankly, that means diversified everywhere, right? As you see natural disasters and even in this crisis, you see an ability to get product in and out and API in and out of some countries more easily than others. So to say that we're just going to take a system that currently exists and flip a switch and then we're just going to have everything come from the United States. I mean, that not only is it unrealistic and especially dangerous, frankly, at this moment in time, but it's actually probably not the right policy because you actually want some diversity in your supply chain. It's good to have some redundancy. It's good to make sure that if you got a hurricane hitting Puerto Rico, that it's not wiping out your entire U.S. Production of pharmaceuticals. So while certainly some movement back to the United States is important and good, it also has to be balanced with an understanding that diversity is also a benefit to the system as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting, the diversification point, as Jim alluded to, during the Puerto Rico hurricane. I think not many people before that time realized, for example, in the medical device industry, that there was a huge manufacturing focus on that island. And so it really is a balance of, are there incentives to have some additional manufacturing encouraged here in the US, as well as in other places.
Appreciate that good discussion. If folks online have any questions, please use the Q&A function. And let me just now shift to the election. I know we sort of started by talking about that. I mean, as we move towards the election, sort of any decision sometimes will get viewed through those lenses. Obviously, for the administration, it was a key policy priority for 2 years, and with COVID on the healthcare side, it's hard for anything to break through. So, these have been announced, but just want to get a sense from all of you, any of you, the degree to which you think the issue of drug prices might be a topic during this election. Will it be able to break through everything that has been about the COVID response? Kavita, I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, sure. I'll start. Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it goes without saying that, yeah, absolutely. Pharmaceutical pricing, drug pricing, and I'll just say cost in general will be a huge kind of topic, whether it plays out in, a debate or probably maybe not, but I would offer that, you already see on Vice President Biden's website, there's already a series of policies around drugs, and he had something decent section on it in the it's called the Biden-Sanders Unity Plan, which was kind of this like group of experts, including Don Berwick and some prominent healthcare thought leaders who helped draft the healthcare part of this document. So there's no question it's going to be part of campaign. It already is part of what I would say, the first 100 days of a new administration would be taking a look at. Absolutely. I just think that it also, like I said earlier, there has already been, whether it's, Grassley-Wyden or HR 3, one should never minimize the role of Congress in this. And so I think that it's important to see where there could be, if there's a new White House and a turnover of some type in Congress, or at least new members and a new kind of initiative, would there be appetite? And I think the answer is yes. And then on the other hand, I think that a second part of a Trump administration clearly would continue to do what they can, including potentially resurfacing some talks with the Hill, et cetera. So I think this is just one of those issues that's not going to go away. I'm personally, frankly, cynical that you can take just kind of one bite at this through some package of drug pricing legislation without dealing with some of the other things we talked about. I just think that it's hard to not talk about access and overall cost, including prices of physician services, et cetera. To me, it all seems to need to be addressed a little more universally. And then the other thing I will just kind of put out here, the growth of Medicare, the original Part C and Medicare Advantage provides very interesting kind of thought experiments on what could work, what doesn't. We've already seen kind of introduction of formularies. There's been movements within Medicare Advantage that have resulted arguably in cost savings that people desperately want to bring into Medicare fee-for-service, traditional Medicare, and now also a body of literature around kind of more capitated, managed care-oriented commercial contracts, especially in Medicaid, which brings up something we haven't touched on. I don't want to throw these things in here, but again, hard to talk about campaign priorities and drugs without talking about 340B and talking about Medicaid best price. So you can see where I'm going. You need to have, and I do think a Biden administration and a Biden campaign will tackle some of that in order to show that they're strong on getting more money into Americans' pockets in some form, et cetera.
Thank you.
I would totally agree. Healthcare in general and drug pricing in particular is always a hot topic. It's always going to be part of a campaign. I mean, it's what people feel. There's obviously a financial, but also an emotional and obviously a health aspect to it. What I think is becoming apparent, though, is that in the context of the COVID crisis is how important what at least my perception of what we do as an industry is how important that is, and and that it really matters that we invest a lot of dollars, a lot of resources, a lot of time. It's a high risk proposition. There's of the literally several hundred, maybe in the thousands of clinical trials going on now. To be honest, there's not going to be that many that actually end up coming out with positive results that result in a product coming on the market. So you've got literally tens of billions of dollars being spent right now searching for a solution to this problem. And I frankly do hope that I think Becky mentioned earlier, the value of a product. I hope that starts to come through, that the value is not just in what it costs to manufacture a pill. That's one part of it, but that's a very small part. There's a lot of risk, and when we're able to find something that has a positive impact, whether it's COVID or cancer or anything else, it has a real positive impact on the lives of people, and not just on their health, but on the economy. I mean, there's not a more stark, example, I think, of that than right now. If there were a solution tomorrow, what would it be worth? The Congress is spending trillions and trillions of dollars, and yet you still see the naysayers of the pharmaceutical industry saying, "Well, gosh, remdesivir just costs too much," or you gotta make sure that when the cure comes out, that it only costs $10 or something. Now, I mean, I'm very confident that at the end of the day that these solutions will be affordable for patients, but it really does highlight that there is a great value to medicine that goes well beyond the cost of the pill itself.
Yeah, I mean, if there's any silver lining to all of this, I mean, there's just been such an extraordinary outpouring of care and concern from innovators, people putting their best minds at work in a really honed way to try to find a solution, get out the right kind of diagnostics, get out the right patient care. People used to say you couldn't develop a vaccine in under several years, and now, we have just an incredible surge of this coming forward, and obviously that takes an enormous investment of talent and treasure to get it done, and then a very important policy conversation about how you make that available to the people who need it in an appropriate way.
This is a great, I think we're going to be able to get a couple minutes back here for folks, but this is a great way, I think, to end, because I've been talking to folks and thinking about it. We've done our own research in terms of seeing, reputational research. I don't think there's ever been a moment in time like this where you have the general public so focused and really rooting for the innovators. And all the time and effort that has been spent, whether it's this industry or the medical device industry, trying to get folks to appreciate that which their providers are using to help them with life-saving and life-improving improvements. But now to turn on cable, to see the latest in what pharmaceutical companies are doing and what the ventilator and testing industries have been able to do. And hand in hand with with the public sector and with BARDA and with this active group at NIH that Dr. Collins is hosting. We had Dr. Fauci speak at an APCO breakfast this morning, and to hear him again, and we hear him almost daily, but to hear him so clearly talk about that public-private partnership that is occurring. And I'm not even sure the general public had even thought of public-private partnerships, even heard the term BARDA before. But this is really a moment in time to appreciate, and also to understand what are those barriers and guard against future barriers that could help to prevent this industry from doing the types of things we're talking about. I don't know if any of you have any final comments before we wrap up. No? Great. Well, really, really appreciate all of this insight. We talked big picture. We got into the weeds. Really looked at some forecasts and some sort of realistic view of some of these policy changes. I really appreciate everyone who dialed in. This panel had a lot of strong interest. We've recorded it today, and we will be posting it. So for folks that weren't able to watch it, we're going to give them a chance to watch the video of it. So again, thank you to our panelists and thank you everyone for dialing in.